The stars themselves seemed to dim as Commander Tyke stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching another world die. Through the massive view screen, he could see Xerion Prime burning. What had once been a thriving planet with floating crystal, cities now looked like a festering wound against the black of space. "Sir, the bio readings are off the charts," Lieutenant Hannah called out from her station, her fingers dancing across holographic displays. "The Vorthak are consuming everything. Plants, animals, even the mineral deposits in the planet's core." Tyke clenched his four-fingered hands. The Altarian Defense Corps had been fighting this war for 8 months now, and they were losing badly. The Vorthak swarm didn't just conquer worlds like normal invaders, they ate them, literally. "How long before they stripped the planet completely?" he asked. "At current consumption rates, maybe 6 hours," Hannah replied, her voice cracking slightly. She was young for a lieutenant, barely past her first molting season. "Then they'll move to the next system." The bridge fell silent, except for the low hum of the ship's energy cores. Tyke had seen this pattern dozens of times now. The Vorthak would arrive in a system with their massive bioships that looked more like giant insects than spacecraft. These living vessels would spawn thousands of smaller creatures that swarmed across planets like a plague. The worst part was how smart they were. Every weapon the Coalition used against them, the Vorthak adapted to within days. Plasma cannons that had destroyed entire fleets became useless when the creatures developed energy-absorbing skin. Particle beams that could crack moons barely scratched their evolved armor plating. "Incoming transmission from High Command," announced Communications Officer Jinwoo, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced by grim efficiency. The hologram of Admiral Soyeon flickered to life in the center of the bridge. Her usually pristine white uniform was wrinkled, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much death. "Commander Tech, I'm afraid I have more bad news. The Vorthak have broken through the Kepler defense line. They're heading straight for the core worlds." Tyke felt his stomach drop. The Kepler line was supposed to be impenetrable. Thousands of automated defense platforms, millions of smart mines, and the combined fleets of 7 species had been stationed there. "How many ships do we have left?" he asked, though he already dreaded the answer. 38% of our original fleet strength," Admiral Soyeon replied. "And most of those ships are running on emergency power. We're out of antimatter, low on fusion cores, and our manufacturing worlds are either destroyed or cut off." Through the view screen, Tyke watched as the Vorthak bioships began their feeding process. Massive tentacles extended from the creatures, each one the size of a city block, and started drilling into Xerion Prime's surface. Within minutes, streams of liquefied matter flowed back into the ships like some horrific digestive process. "Sir, we're receiving an emergency broadcast from the Council of Worlds," Hannah reported. "They're calling for an immediate assembly." The council chamber was a sight that would have been impressive under better circumstances. Representatives from 12 different species sat around a circular table that floated in the center of a vast transparent dome. Outside, stars wheeled slowly as the station rotated, but today those stars seemed to mock them with their cold, distant light. Elder Wonbin of the Crystalline Collective spoke first, his voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "We have lost 63% of our territory in 8 months. Our most advanced civilizations, races that have existed for millions of years, are being consumed like insects." "The Vorthak are not just winning," added Councillor Nari of the Machine Intelligence. "They are learning. Each battle makes them stronger while making us weaker." Tyke looked around the chamber at faces that showed every emotion from rage to despair. The Zephyrian delegate had all 6 of his eyes closed in what their species considered deep meditation. The rocky-skinned terraformer representative kept shifting colors from gray to deep red, a sign of extreme agitation among his people. "There must be something we haven't tried," insisted Youngjae of the psionic orders. "Some weapon, some strategy, some alliance we can form." That's when the impossible happened. Long-range sensors began beeping frantically across the chamber. A small fleet had just appeared at the edge of the system, requesting permission to dock. "Who would be stupid enough to travel here during a war?" muttered Elder Wonbin. Communications Officer Sion announced the answer with barely contained disbelief. "The ships are from the Sol system. It's the humans." The chamber erupted in a mixture of laughter and gasps. Humans were barely more than primitives who had only recently developed faster-than-light travel. Their entire civilization was confined to a single star system, and their technology was thousands of years behind most coalition members. They want to help fight the Vorthak, Sion continued. Some council members actually started laughing out loud. Others simply stared in shock. The idea that humans could contribute anything meaningful to this war seemed absurd, but Tyke remembered something he had read in the preliminary reports about Earth. These humans had spent most of their history fighting each other. Unlike the peaceful species of the coalition, humanity had never known a time without war. Maybe, just maybe, that experience might be exactly what they needed. Captain Minho's boots echoed through the pristine corridors of the coalition flagship as he made his way to the war room. Behind him walked his senior officers, their simple grey uniforms looking plain next to the elaborate ceremonial dress of the alien crew members they passed. Every alien they encountered stopped to stare at the humans with a mixture of curiosity and barely hidden amusement. The human fleet that had arrived consisted of 12 ships, each one looking like it had been cobbled together from spare parts and determination. Where coalition vessels were smooth curves of polished metal and glowing energy conduits, human ships were angular blocks of reinforced steel covered in sensor arrays, weapon mounts, and what looked like patches welded over battle damage. "Are those really their warships?" whispered a young Altarian ensign to his companion as the humans passed. "They look like cargo haulers." Sergeant G1, walking just behind Captain Minho, turned her head slightly and smiled. "Cargo haulers that bite back," she said in perfect Altarian, causing the ensign to jump in surprise. The war room was a massive chamber filled with holographic displays showing the current tactical situation. Red dots marked Vorthak-controlled systems, while the shrinking blue areas represented coalition territory. At the center of it all stood Admiral Tyek, his four arms moving quickly between different control panels as he coordinated what remained. "For their defenses, Captain Minho," Admiral Tyek said, turning to greet the human commander. "I must admit we didn't expect Earth to respond to our distress call." "We got your message about 3 months ago," Minho replied, extending his hand, in the human gesture of greeting. "It took us a while to get here." Lieutenant Hana looked puzzled. "Your ships don't seem equipped for long-range travel. How did you cross such distances so quickly?" "We stripped everything non-essential from our vessels," explained Lieutenant. Commander Deho, Minho's second-in-command. "No luxury quarters, no diplomatic facilities, barely enough life support. Just weapons, engines, and crew." Admiral Tyke brought up a tactical display of Kepler Station, the massive space fortress that had fallen to the Vorthak just 2 days earlier. The station was enormous, easily the size of a small moon, and now crawled with bioships that pulsed with sickly green light. "This is our priority target," Tyke explained. "If we can retake Kepler Station, we can cut off the Vorthak advance into the core systems, but as you can see, it's heavily defended." The display showed thousands of Vorthak creatures swarming around the station like angry insects. Some were the size of fighter craft, darting between the station's massive support struts. Others were as large as destroyers, their biomechanical forms bristling with organic weapons that fired streams of corrosive acid. "We've already lost 3 assault fleets trying to retake it," continued Admiral Tech. "The Crystalline Collective's mirror ships were dissolved by acid weapons. The Machine Intelligence's robot fighters were reprogrammed by Vorthak neural viruses. The Psionic Order's mind control techniques don't work on creatures with distributed nervous systems." Captain Minho studied the tactical display for several minutes, his dark eyes taking in every detail. His officers gathered around him, pointing at various features and speaking in rapid, quiet Korean that the universal translators couldn't quite keep up with. "What's your assessment?" Admiral Tyke asked. "You're fighting them like civilized beings," Minho said finally. "Honor guards, established formations, rules of engagement designed to minimize casualties." "Of course," replied Lieutenant Hana. "We're not barbarians." Sergeant G1 stepped forward, her hand resting on the grip of what looked like an incredibly primitive kinetic weapon. Where coalition forces carried elegant energy weapons that hummed with contained power, her rifle was all sharp angles and mechanical parts. "With respect, Lieutenant, maybe you need to be," she said, So these Vorthak things adapt to your weapons because your weapons follow patterns, energy output, frequency modulation, targeting algorithms. They're predictable. And human weapons aren't, asked Communications Officer Jinwoo. Our weapons are. Stupid, replied Major Kyung-min with a grin. Dumb chunks of metal moving really fast. No energy signature to adapt to. No frequency to modify. No algorithm to hack. Just kinetic force and explosive chemistry. Admiral Tyke looked skeptical. You're suggesting we attack one of the most heavily defended positions in the galaxy with primitive projectile weapons? Not just projectile weapons, Captain Minho said, pulling up his own tactical display. We brought nuclear warheads, electromagnetic pulse generators, chemical weapons, and about 50 other things that your coalition probably banned centuries ago. The alien officers in the room looked horrified. Elder Wonbin, who had arrived to observe the briefing, actually changed color from his normal crystal-clear transparency to a shocked opaque white. Those weapons are illegal under 17 different galactic treaties, he protested. The Vorthak didn't sign those treaties, Sergeant G1 pointed out, and they're eating your planets. The battle plan that emerged was unlike anything the Coalition had ever seen. While their previous assaults had been carefully coordinated affairs with ships moving in precise formations, the human plan looked like controlled chaos. Small human. Fighters would dart in unpredictably, firing random bursts from different weapons to confuse the Vorthak adaptation systems. Larger ships would launch waves of simple kinetic projectiles, everything from depleted uranium rounds to chunks of asteroid. Debris accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. What about casualties? Asked Admiral Tech. These Vorthak bioships are incredibly dangerous at close range. Captain Minho and his officers exchanged glances. Admiral, we've been fighting wars on Earth for thousands of years. We understand. Acceptable losses. Acceptable losses. Some of our people won't be coming back, Lieutenant Commander Daeho said simply. They know this. They volunteered anyway. The assault began 12 hours later. Coalition forces watched in fascination and horror as human ships broke every rule of space combat they had ever learned. Instead of maintaining safe distances and firing from maximum range, human fighters dove straight into the swarms of Vorthak creatures, guns blazing. The bioships tried to adapt to the incoming fire, but there was nothing consistent to adapt. At one moment they faced armor-piercing rounds, the next explosive shells, then electromagnetic pulses, then simple chunks of metal moving at incredible speeds. Sergeant Jiwon led a boarding party that actually landed on the station itself, something no coalition force had even attempted. Armed with weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum, her team fought their way through corridors filled with writhing biomechanical horrors. Target their power nodes, she radioed back to the fleet. These things are like big nervous systems. Cut the connections and they go stupid. The battle raged for 6 hours. When it was over, Kepler Station was back in Coalition hands, and the Vorthak were retreating for the first time since the war began. As Captain Minho stood on the station's recaptured command deck, Admiral Tyke approached him with something approaching. "Oh, how did you know it would work?" "We didn't," Minho replied honestly. "But on Earth we learned a long time ago that sometimes the best plan is to hit the enemy with something they've never seen before." The laboratory aboard the human medical ship looked nothing like the sterile, pristine research facilities the Coalition was used to. Dr. Shung had set up his equipment in what looked more like a battlefield surgery unit, with exposed cables, running across the floor and monitoring devices that beeped and hummed with urgent intensity. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" asked Dr. Yuto, the lead xenobiologist from the Centauri Science Guild. His 6 eyes were wide with concern as he watched the human scientist prepare for something that violated every safety protocol in the Galactic Medical Handbook. Dr. Seung didn't look up from his work as he calibrated the neural interface device. The captured Vorthak specimen writhed in its containment field, a creature that looked like a cross between a giant spider and some kind of living computer. Its biomechanical parts pulsed with sickly green light, and occasionally it would emit sounds that made everyone in the lab feel uncomfortable. "Doctor, this creature's neural network could contain viruses, mental parasites, or worse," pressed Dr. Yuto. Direct interface with an alien mind has never been attempted. That's because your people are too careful, replied Dr. Xiang, attaching the interface cables to ports that had been surgically implanted behind his ears. On Earth, we've been experimenting with dangerous biology for centuries. Smallpox, anthrax, engineered viruses that could wipe out entire populations. This is just another lab specimen. Lieutenant Commander Deho, who was observing the experiment, stepped forward. Doctor, even for us this seems extremely risky. Dr. Xiang smiled grimly. Commander, 3 months ago we didn't even know aliens existed. Now we're at war with creatures that eat planets. I'd say the risk calculation has changed. The interface activated with a sound like breaking glass mixed with electronic feedback. Dr. Xiang's body went rigid as his consciousness connected directly with the Vorthak specimen's distributed neural network. The monitoring devices around the lab began displaying patterns that no one had ever seen before. His brain activity is off the charts, whispered Dr. Yuto, watching waves of data flow across his screens. The neural pathways are completely restructuring themselves. What Dr. Xiang discovered in those first few minutes of connection changed everything. The Vorthak weren't just biological creatures that had evolved naturally. They were engineered, beings created by some long-dead civilization as the ultimate adaptive weapon. Their entire existence was based on consuming and learning from their enemies. They're not just eating our planets, Dr. Xiang gasped, his voice strained from the mental connection. They're studying us. Every weapon we use, every tactic we employ gets added to their collective knowledge. But the connection worked both ways. As Dr. Xiang learned from the Vorthak, the creature was also learning from him. And what it found in the human mind was unlike anything it had encountered in its conquest of 1,000 worlds. The specimen began convulsing violently. Its biomechanical components started shutting down one by one, and the sickly green glow faded to a dull gray. Within minutes, the creature that had been writhing with alien intelligence was reduced to lifeless organic matter. What happened? Asked Dr. Yuto in amazement. Dr. Xiang disconnected the interface cables, rubbing his temples where the ports were still glowing with residual energy. It couldn't handle human memories, our history, our wars, our capacity for violence and destruction. The creature's mind literally overloaded trying to process it all. News of Dr. Xiang's breakthrough spread through the coalition fleet within hours. But more importantly, the information began reaching human tactical units across the war zone. Captain Minho was in the middle of planning the next assault when the data package arrived. They adapt to patterns, he explained to his assembled strike team leaders, but they can't adapt to chaos. Every time we change tactics completely, it takes them longer to respond. Major Kyungmin, studying the biological data on her tablet, looked up with a dangerous grin. So we don't give them time to adapt. The next series of battles became a masterclass in unpredictable warfare. Human forces would attack a Vorthak position using conventional kinetic weapons, then suddenly switch to chemical explosives, then electromagnetic pulses, then simple ramming, attacks. Each engagement was completely different from the last. Sergeant Jiwon led a boarding mission where her team used flamethrowers, ancient weapons that the galaxy hadn't seen in millennia. The Vorthak bioships had no defense against simple fire because no civilized species had used such primitive weapons in centuries. Target their reproductive chambers, she radioed to her squad as they fought through corridors filled with writhing, organic machinery. These things breed fast, but they can't breed if they're ash. The psychological effect on the Vorthak was immediate and dramatic. For the first time since their conquest began, they started making mistakes. Ships that should have adapted to human weapons instead began shutting down randomly. Creatures that had shown perfect coordination started attacking each other. Dr. Xiang, now permanently connected to captured Vorthak specimens through his neural interface, reported something that shocked even the human command structure. They're afraid, he announced during a briefing with Admiral Tyke and the coalition leadership. These creatures have conquered 1,000 civilizations, but they've never encountered a species like us. What makes humans so different? Asked Elder Wanbin. Every other species they've fought became more civilized as they advanced technologically, Dr. Xiang explained. They gave up biological weapons, chemical warfare, nuclear devastation. They developed codes of honor, rules of engagement, treaties, to limit the horrors of war. And humans didn't, asked Lieutenant Hana. We did the opposite, replied Captain Minho. The more advanced we became, the more efficient we got at killing each other. We turned warfare into a science. We studied destruction the way other species study art. The Vorthak had evolved to fight civilized enemies who followed predictable patterns, who valued honor over victory, who would rather lose with dignity than win through brutality. They had never faced an opponent that treated war as total commitment to victory, regardless of the cost. Human ships began appearing throughout coalition space, each one carrying weapons and tactics that would have been considered barbaric by galactic standards. They brought diseases engineered to target specific biological processes, electromagnetic weapons that fried nervous systems, and kinetic bombardment systems that could crack planets. But perhaps most terrifying of all, they brought human soldiers, who understood something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes survival requires becoming the monster. The tide of war was turning, and for the first time in their existence, the Vorthak swarm was learning what it meant to be prey instead of predator. They had conquered civilizations, but now they faced something that had spent its entire existence perfecting the art of conquest. The galaxy was about to discover that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their courage. It was their refusal to fight fair when everything they cared about was at stake. The command deck of the massive coalition flagship had never seen anything like this before. General Minji stood at the center of a holographic battle map that showed over 3,000 ships from dozens of different species, all under human command. It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, and it was about to attempt something that many considered impossible. General, the Altarian fleet commanders are requesting clarification on the attack formation, reported Captain Hyunwoo, General Minji's aide. They say it violates every principle of space combat they've ever learned. General Minji smiled as she looked at the concerned faces of alien officers around the command center. That's exactly the point, Captain. Admiral Tak approached with what looked like deep concern etched across his features. General, with respect, this plan seems like organized suicide. You're asking us to abandon formations that have protected our fleets for thousands of years. Admiral, those same formations got 60% of your territory consumed by the Vorthak, General Minji replied, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. Your traditional tactics work perfectly against civilized enemies who follow the same rules you do. The Vorthak aren't civilized. She gestured to the holographic display where red markers showed Vorthak positions throughout the galaxy. Look at their movement patterns. They expect you to maintain safe distances, coordinate your attacks, and withdraw when casualties reach acceptable levels. We're going to do none of those things. Lieutenant Commander Sunho, who had been quietly observing from the side, stepped forward. General, the Crystalline Collective representatives are expressing serious concerns about the mission parameters we've given their ships. What kind of concerns? Asked General Minji. They say we're asking them to ram Vorthak bioships with their vessels if conventional weapons fail. They've never used their ships as weapons before. General Minji turned to address Elder Wanbin, who was present as the Crystalline Collective's representative. Elder, how many of your worlds has the Vorthak consumed? 17 colony worlds. And our secondary manufacturing hub, Elder Wanbin replied, his crystalline form dimming with what appeared to be sadness. And how many more will they consume if we lose this battle? Elder Wanbin was silent for a long moment. All of them. Then I suggest you learn to use your ships as weapons, General Minji said simply, because that's what they are now. The briefing room fell silent as the reality of their situation sank in. These alien species had known peace for so long that they had forgotten what total war actually meant. Their conflicts had been limited affairs with rules, boundaries, and acceptable casualty rates. Dr. Yuto of the Centauri Science Guild raised one of his 6 hands. General, humans seem to approach warfare differently than any species we've encountered. Can you explain why? General Minji walked over to a secondary display that showed Earth's historical timeline. Doctor, every species in this room achieved interstellar travel after reaching a certain level of civilization. You stopped fighting major wars, centuries or millennia, before you reached the stars. The display showed images of human history, ancient battles, medieval sieges, industrial warfare, and finally the devastating conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries. Humans did the opposite, she continued. We got better at killing each other as we got more advanced. We invented weapons that could destroy our entire planet multiple times over. We created diseases that could wipe out our entire species. We built machines that could end all life on Earth. Lieutenant Hanna, who had been following human military doctrine for weeks now, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How did your species survive if you were so destructive? We learned that sometimes the only way to prevent total destruction is to be willing to cause it, General Minji replied. We call it mutually assured destruction. If everyone knows that starting a war means everyone dies, nobody starts the war. Captain Hyunwoo pulled up tactical data on his tablet. General Lieutenant Kyung is requesting final confirmation for Operation Hellfire. General Minji nodded grimly. Operation Hellfire was perhaps the most dangerous mission ever attempted. Lieutenant Kyung and his team would pilot small craft directly into the largest Vorthak bioship and manually detonate antimatter charges from the inside. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. Tell Lieutenant Kyung he has authorization to proceed, she said. Admiral Taik looked horrified. General, you're sending those men to certain death. I'm giving them the chance to save billions of lives, General Minji corrected. Lieutenant Kyung volunteered for this mission, so did every member of his team. The truth was even more remarkable than Admiral Taik realized. When news of Operation Hellfire had spread through the human fleet, over 200 soldiers had volunteered for what they knew was a one-way trip. They had to hold a lottery to select the final team. This is madness, whispered Dr. Yuto. No, rational being would volunteer for certain death. Major Kyungmin, who was coordinating the assault from her position at the tactical station, looked up from her displays. Doctor, rationality is a luxury you can afford when your survival isn't threatened. When it is, you do whatever it takes. The battle began 3 hours later. Coalition forces abandoned every principle of civilized warfare they had ever learned. Instead of maintaining formation, ships scattered randomly across the battlefield. Instead of coordinating attacks, each vessel operated independently. Instead of retreating when damaged, ships continued fighting until they were completely destroyed. The Vorthak, masters of adaptation, found themselves facing something they couldn't adapt to: complete unpredictability, backed by absolute commitment. Lieutenant Kyung's small fighter craft weaved through the chaos of the battlefield, dodging bioprojectiles and acid streams as he approached the massive Vorthak command ship. Behind him, his team of 12 volunteers followed in similar craft, each one carrying enough antimatter to vaporize a small moon. This is Hellfire 1, Lieutenant Kyung radioed back to the fleet. Beginning final approach, it's been an honor serving with all of you. His fighter disappeared into the bioship's organic hull like a needle-piercing skin. 11 other fighters followed. For 10 minutes there was no communication from inside the massive creature. Then space lit up like a newborn star. The explosion was visible from 3 systems away. The Vorthak command ship, a creature the size of a small planet that had existed for thousands of years, simply ceased to exist. With it died the central intelligence that had been coordinating the entire swarm. Across the battlefield, Vorthak bioships began behaving erratically. Some started attacking each other. Others simply stopped moving entirely. The few that remained functional began something that no one had ever seen before. They started running away. General, Captain Hyunwoo reported, his voice filled with amazement, the Vorthak are retreating. All across the front they're abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the Galactic Edge. General Minji watched the tactical display as red markers representing Vorthak forces began disappearing one by one. Signal all coalition forces to pursue but maintain caution. We've won this battle, but we need to make sure they don't regroup. Admiral Taik approached her with something that looked like awe mixed with horror. General, your people just did something that was considered impossible. You made the Vorthak afraid. Admiral, fear is just another weapon, General Minji replied. And like all weapons, it's most effective when your enemy doesn't expect you to use it. The galaxy had learned something important that day. Civilization was a beautiful thing, but survival sometimes required setting civilization aside. The Vorthak had conquered 1,000 civilized worlds, but they had never faced an uncivilized enemy that was willing to do whatever it took to win. For the first time in millennia, the galaxy was safe, and it had humanity to thank for remembering that sometimes the only way to preserve peace is to perfect the art of war. The rebuilt Galactic Council chamber looked magnificent in the morning light of 3 different suns. Where once there had been emergency sessions filled with desperation and fear, now representatives from dozens of species gathered in celebration. The war against the Vorthak swarm was over, and the galaxy was finally at peace. Admiral Minho walked through corridors that had been redesigned using human engineering principles. Where the original station had prioritized beauty and ceremony, the new construction focused on redundancy and survivability. Multiple power sources, backup life support systems, and emergency escape routes were built into every section. "Bistio, Council is ready for your address, Admiral," announced Lieutenant Commander Deho, who now served as the human liaison to the coalition government. 6 months ago, humans had been unknown primitives from a backwater system. Today, Admiral Minho was about to address the most powerful political body in the galaxy as an equal among ancient civilizations that had ruled the stars for millions of years. The council chamber itself had changed dramatically. The elegant floating table had been replaced by a more practical semicircular arrangement that allowed for better communication and faster decision-making. Human influence was everywhere, from the efficient lighting systems to the strategic placement of emergency equipment. Elder Wanbin of the Crystalline Collective was the first to speak as Admiral Minho took his position at the podium. "Admiral, on behalf of all surviving species, we want to express our gratitude for humanity's role in ending the Vorthak threat." Admiral Minho nodded respectfully. Around him, representatives from 12 different species watched with expressions that ranged from admiration to something approaching wariness. They had learned to respect human military capabilities, but they were still adjusting to having such a young and aggressive species as their equals. "Honored council members," Admiral Minho began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's new acoustic systems, "6 months ago, you were facing extinction. Your most advanced civilizations, your most powerful fleets, your most sophisticated weapons had all failed against an enemy that seemed unstoppable." Dr. Yuto of the Centauri Science Guild leaned forward in his seat. "Admiral, our preliminary analysis suggests that the Vorthak had conquered over 1,500 star systems before encountering humanity. What made the difference?" "The difference was that you were fighting a civilized war against an uncivilized enemy," Admiral Minho replied. "Your species had evolved beyond the need for total warfare. You had developed codes of honor, rules of engagement, and acceptable casualty rates. These things make you better people, but they made you predictable opponents." Admiral Tyke, who now served as the Coalition's Chief of Military Operations, stood to address the chamber. The human approach to warfare was unlike anything we had ever encountered. They were willing to sacrifice everything for victory. "Not for victory," Admiral Minho corrected gently. "For survival. There's a difference." He activated a holographic display that showed the current state of the galaxy. Where 6 months ago the map had been dominated by red markers indicating Vorthak control, now it showed the slow process of rebuilding and expansion. "The Vorthak adapted to your weapons and tactics because they followed patterns," he continued. "Energy output levels, targeting algorithms, formation structures. Everything you did was logical and predictable. We won because we were willing to be illogical and unpredictable." Counselor Nari of the Machine Intelligence raised one of her mechanical appendages. "Admiral, our analysis indicates that human casualties during the war were significantly higher than Coalition standards would normally accept. How do you justify such losses?" The chamber fell silent. This was the question that had been haunting many of the alien representatives. Human. Military doctrine had achieved victory, but at a cost that seemed almost barbaric to species that had known millennia of peace. Counselor Nari, how many beings were living in coalition space before the war began? Admiral Minho asked. Approximately 400 billion across all member worlds, she replied. And how many would be alive today if we had lost? The mechanical being's optical sensors dimmed slightly. 0. We lost 12,000 human soldiers during the war, Admiral Minho said. 12,000 volunteers who understood that their sacrifice might save 400 billion lives. I don't consider that barbaric. I consider it mathematics. Elder Wanbin shifted colors from clear to a soft blue, which indicated deep thought among his species. Admiral, human military innovations are being implemented throughout coalition space. Our fleets are being restructured, our weapons upgraded, our tactics completely rewritten. Are we becoming more like humans? You're becoming more like survivors. Admiral Minho replied, That's not the same thing. The truth was that human influence was spreading far beyond military applications. Human engineers were designing new types of spacecraft that prioritized function over form. Human scientists were developing technologies with multiple redundant systems instead of elegant single-point solutions. Human philosophers were even influencing coalition social policies, introducing concepts like acceptable risk and necessary sacrifice. Captain Hyunwoo, who had been monitoring communications during the council session, approached Admiral Minho with a concerned expression. Sir, we're receiving priority signals from long-range sensor stations along the galactic rim. What kind of signals? Admiral Minho asked. Unknown contacts approaching from the Andromeda galaxy, Captain Hyunwoo replied quietly. The sensor profiles don't match any known species. Lieutenant Hana, who now served as the Coalition's chief intelligence officer, joined the conversation with her data tablet in hand. Admiral, the approaching objects are massive, larger than anything the Vorthak ever deployed, and they're moving in formation. Admiral Minho felt a familiar sensation in his stomach. It was the same feeling he had experienced when humanity first learned about the Vorthak swarm. The galaxy was about to face another threat, and once again, they might not be prepared for it. How long until they reach coalition space? He asked. At current speed, approximately 18 months, Lieutenant Hana replied. Admiral Minho looked around the council chamber at the representatives of species that had just learned to fight for their survival. 6 months ago, they had been helpless against the Vorthak. Today, they were stronger, more adaptable, and more willing to do whatever it took to protect their worlds. Signal all coalition fleets to begin preparations for potential contact, he ordered, and send a message to Earth. Tell them we might need more ships. Elder Wanbin overheard the conversation and approached with obvious concern. Admiral, are we facing another war? Elder, we're facing the unknown, Admiral Minho replied. But this time we're not facing it as separate species following ancient protocols. We're facing it as allies who understand that survival sometimes requires difficult choices. The galaxy had changed. The elegant, civilized societies that had once ruled the stars with honor and dignity had learned to fight dirty when necessary. They had discovered that sometimes the difference between extinction and survival was the willingness to become something you didn't want to be. As the council session ended and representatives began making preparations for whatever was approaching, from Andromeda, Admiral Minho stood at the chamber's observation deck, looking out at stars that suddenly seemed less peaceful than they had moments before. The universe was vast and full of dangers that civilized beings couldn't imagine. But humanity had taught the galaxy something important. No matter what was coming, they would face it together, and they would do whatever it took to survive. The stars held new challenges, but the galaxy was ready for them. The end.